Make an avoidant regret, ghosting or leaving you. Have you ever watched someone disappear from your life without warning, leaving behind unanswered questions, unfinished conversations, and a silence that feels louder than any argument ever could? When an avoidant ghosts you or walks away, the first instinct is often to chase, explain, prove your worth, or somehow make them understand what they lost. But what if the very things most people do after being abandoned are the exact reasons an avoidant never feels the full weight of their decision? And what if the one thing that creates genuine regret is something completely different from what you might expect? Today we're talking about how to make an avoidant regret ghosting or leaving you, not through manipulation, games, or revenge, but through a shift so powerful that it changes the entire dynamic forever. The first thing you need to understand is that avoidants often expect a reaction after they leave. They expect texts asking for explanations, emotional messages seeking closure, and attempts to reconnect that reassure them they still occupy a central place in your world. When those reactions happen, they may feel temporary relief because the focus remains on them instead of on the consequences of their choice. That is why the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to make your healing dependent on their return. The moment your energy stops chasing someone who left, the dynamic begins to change in ways they rarely expect. Most people think regret comes from making someone jealous, but true regret comes from realizing a valuable connection existed and was lost. An avoidant cannot fully experience that realization if they always believe you will remain available whenever they decide to return. The more accessible you remain after being discarded, the less urgency they feel to reflect on what happened. But when you quietly move forward, something important begins happening behind the scenes. The space that once contained your attention, validation, and emotional support suddenly becomes empty. And for the first time, they are left alone with the reality of their own decision. One of the biggest mistakes people make after being ghosted is trying to convince the avoidant that they made a mistake. The truth is that people rarely value something because they are told to value it. They value it when they experience its absence and understand what it contributed to their life. Every emotional message sent after being rejected often delays that process instead of encouraging it. Your silence is not punishment when it comes from self-respect rather than resentment. It is simply an acknowledgement that your value does not require constant explanation or defense. Avoidants often become accustomed to people pursuing them even after disappointing behavior. When someone finally stops chasing and starts choosing themselves, it breaks a pattern they may have come to expect. That unexpected shift frequently creates curiosity, reflection, and sometimes regret. Another powerful way to create regret is by becoming the version of yourself that was waiting to emerge all along. Many people spend months obsessing over what the avoidant is doing, thinking, or feeling. Meanwhile, their own growth remains paused because all of their attention stays locked on the past. But imagine directing that same energy toward improving your confidence, health, goals, friendships, and overall happiness. Imagine becoming so engaged in your own life that their absence no longer defines your daily emotional state. That transformation is often more impactful than any message you could ever send. People notice when someone they left becomes stronger rather than more broken. They notice when the person they expected to remain stuck begins creating a life filled with purpose and momentum. Growth communicates value far more effectively than pleading ever could. And perhaps most importantly, growth benefits you regardless of whether the avoidant ever looks back. One thing that surprises many people is that avoidants are not always as unaffected as they appear. Their emotional processing often works differently from people with more anxious attachment patterns. While an anxious person may feel the pain immediately, an avoidant may suppress emotions until much later. At first, leaving can feel like relief because distance removes emotional pressure. But eventually, the distractions fade and reality begins catching up. That is often when memories return and questions begin surfacing. They may remember the support you offered during difficult times. They may remember your loyalty, patience, and genuine care. They may remember the safety they felt before fear convinced them to create distance. The problem is that many people interrupt this process by reappearing before reflection has a chance to happen. They rush back into communication because the silence feels unbearable. As a result, the avoidant never fully experiences the consequences of their choice. Patience becomes incredibly important during this stage. Not because you are waiting for them, but because healing takes time and emotional clarity cannot be forced. The less you try to control their realization, the more likely it becomes that any realization will be genuine. Another thing that creates regret is maintaining your dignity after being hurt. Many people understandably react from a place of anger and pain after being abandoned. They send long emotional messages, make public accusations, or try to force accountability through confrontation. While those reactions may feel justified, they rarely create the outcome people hope for. Dignity has a different kind of power. It communicates that although you were hurt, you still recognize your own worth. It shows that another person's inability to appreciate you does not determine your value. There is something unforgettable about someone who refuses to become bitter after disappointment. That kind of strength leaves a lasting impression because it reflects emotional maturity rather than emotional dependency. Avoidants often expect rejection to produce chaos. When instead they encounter grace, self-respect, and forward movement, it can challenge many of their assumptions. Regret often grows when people realize they walked away from someone emotionally healthy and genuinely valuable. This brings us to another important truth. You cannot make an avoidant regret leaving through pressure, guilt, or manipulation. Any regret produced through those methods is temporary because it comes from discomfort rather than genuine understanding. Real regret develops when someone independently recognizes what they lost, and that recognition cannot be forced into existence. What you can control is the way you respond after they leave. You can control whether you abandon yourself while mourning their absence. You can control whether your future remains tied to someone else's choices. And you can control whether this experience becomes a source of growth instead of a source of permanent emotional limitation. Ironically, the moment many people stop trying to make an avoidant regret leaving is often the moment regret becomes most likely, because they are no longer focused on creating an emotional reaction. They are focused on creating a better life. That shift changes everything. It moves your attention away from the person who walked away and back toward the person who stayed. The greatest regret an avoidant can experience is not seeing you with someone new or hearing about your success through mutual friends. The greatest regret comes from realizing they left someone who genuinely cared, someone who was willing to build something meaningful, and someone who eventually learned to thrive without them. That realization carries weight because it cannot be dismissed as a game or manipulation. It reflects reality, and reality is often far more powerful than any strategy designed to provoke a reaction. So if you want to make an avoidant regret ghosting or leaving you, stop focusing on making them feel something. Focus on becoming someone who no longer needs their validation to feel complete. Focus on rebuilding your confidence, protecting your peace, and investing in the future that still belongs to you. Because the strongest message you can ever send is not a text, an explanation, or an emotional goodbye. It is a life that continues moving forward with strength, purpose, and self-respect long after someone else chose to walk away.